Does the King James Bible contain translation errors? Yes, it does. It contains lots of errors. I'm going to go over 10 of them right now. The goddess we know today as Asherah shows up in the Bible often, over 40 times. However, in the King James Bible, they didn't know that this was reference to a female deity named Asherah. So when it showed up in the Bible, they didn't know how to translate it. And when it shows up specifically as an idiom for an idol, so when Asherah shows up in Hebrew as Asherim or Asherot, it typically refers to wooden idols carved to use in the worship of Asherah. It translates this in the King James as grove or groves. So here's one flawed translation passage. And they left all the commandments of the Lord their God, and they made them molten images, 2 calves, and made a grove, and worshipped all the hosts of heaven and served Baal. But this shouldn't read grove. They didn't make a grove of trees. What they did is they made asherim. They made idols for the goddess Asherah, and they worshiped that along with the calves and the other idols. Everywhere Asherah shows up in the King James Bible, they have no idea what it is, because we didn't really discover Asherah until the turn of the 19th century, when archaeology allowed us to examine the ancient Near Eastern and the Canaanite context more closely. Another famous translation error is in Genesis 1:1. We didn't have to go very far. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. It should be translated as the heavens, plural, because Hashemayim in Hebrew is plural, and the heavens is a collective noun referring to the skies. It is not a celestial plane that we call heaven, where everybody goes when they pass away. And of course, we see another translation error related to heaven and earth in Isaiah 65:17-18, where the King James translates, "For behold, I create new heavens and a new earth." And again, "But ye be glad and rejoice forever in that I create. For behold, I create Jerusalem, and rejoicing in her people a joy." None of this is actually correct. It should read, "I am creating." This is a call participle, so it should have an ing ending. And if you read the context of the passage, it actually says, "For behold, I am creating a new heaven and a new earth, and the former shall not be remembered nor come into mind." The context of the passage dictates that this is the creative action of God in the participle form. This is not a statement about who God is, what he does, or that he does create. This is an active verb about what God is specifically doing. So it should say, "I am creating." Another blunder happens in Exodus 23:18, and it's not as much a translation mistake as it is the King James translators trying to interpret the text for you. It says, "Thou shalt not offer the blood of my sacrifice with leavened bread, neither shall the fat of my sacrifice remain until the morning." But these are actually two separate words in the Hebrew language. So savahi in Hebrew means my sacrifice, and hagi in Hebrew really means like my feast or my meal or even my festival. And so these are two different words. King James translators tried to conflate the two different words so that the reader wouldn't get confused, but it is in fact two completely separate words, and there really is no need to put your own opinion into this text. Their opinion is that the part of the feast that is not to remain until the morning is specifically the part that was sacrificed to God. So they put that in there, even though it's not really part of the original text. Another translation comes from Genesis 49:6, when Jacob basically chastises his 2 sons, Simon and Levi, for what they did to the Shechemites after Dinah was raped by one of the Shechemites. He says, referencing his 2 sons, "In their anger they slew a man, and in their self-will they dug down a wall." But the text does not say that in their self-will they dug down a wall. It says that they had hamstrung oxen. So the proper reading would be, "And at their whim they have hamstrung the oxen." And this is quite obvious if you read any of the Hebrew commentary from the Talmud or from the rabbinic writings. They specifically state that it was a lamed or a hamstrung ox. And if you go back and read the story, it is quite clear that what they did was they went and they killed many of the Shechemites, and then they also killed many of the Shechemites' animals, and that's why it says that they hamstrung the oxen. They did not dig down any walls. The Hebrew word that was used in the passage, ikaru, basically means to pull up, and this is the intensive form of the Hebrew verb. And when it refers to pulling up on an animal or an oxen, it usually refers to pulling up them by the hamstring or hamstringing the animal, basically making it lame, which is why the rabbinic sages all throughout history has interpreted this as laming the ox or laming an animal. Another famous example comes from Genesis 38:18, where Judah is caught in basically a trap by his daughter-in-law, who poses as a prostitute and has him sleep with her. And then in lieu of payment, she takes some of his personal possessions so that it acts as collateral, so he'll have to come back and pay her. But it's translated here, and he said, "What pledge shall I give thee?" And she said, "Thy signet and thy bracelets and thy staff." And that is thine hand, that he gave it to her and came into her, and she conceived by him. So what she's asking for is both positive identification and for collateral, but what in the world is bracelets doing in here? The signet is easily translated, but they didn't know what this word meant. This word basically gets translated typically as cord nowadays, but in 1611, this was not necessarily known, and they didn't understand how signets typically were carried on the body. So they didn't know if the cord was related to the signet or if it was worn around the wrist. Now, there were two types of signet devices in the ancient world. One was a ring that you could wear on your finger, and then you would stamp a piece of clay or a piece of melted wax. The other is a cylinder seal, which I have a replica here. And you would have a cylinder seal that had various items carved into it, and then you would roll that over top of the wax. But this is important because this type of signet usually had a hole drilled through the middle of it. Then you would put a cord through it, and you would wear it around your neck. You would not wear it around your wrist ever. So when it translates cords as bracelet, the ancient translators didn't realize that the Hebrew word here, cord, was actually in reference to the signet. The signet and the cord are a two-piece construction. The ancient translators did not know that. So when they came to the word cords, they just assumed it was a bracelet. They didn't have the archaeological information that we had today to realize that the cord was specifically used to tether the signet. Another translation mistake that shows up all over the Old Testament is the translation of plain, where it should say oak or terebinth. For example, in Genesis 12:6, and Abraham passed through the land unto the place of Shechem, unto the plain of Moreh, and the Canaanite was then in the land. But we know now, because we have lots of comparative Hebrew texts, that the word used in the underlying text actually means tree, either an oak tree or a terebinth tree. And we also have confirmation of this because in both the Greek Septuagint and the Syriac Peshitta, it is translated as oak tree. And one of my favorite translation mistakes is in Genesis 29:17. It says Leah was tender-eyed, but Rachel was beautiful and well-favored. But it should say beautiful in form. They actually just didn't translate part of this compound phrase where it says Yafet Toar. That means beautiful in form in Hebrew. They might not have understood what it fully meant. They thought that maybe it was just an idiom, but the translators just chose not to translate part of the passage. And last but not least, metallurgy problems in Deuteronomy 8:9. A land wherein thou shalt eat bread without scarceness, and thou shalt not lack anything in it. A land whose stones are iron, and out of whose hills mayest thou dig brass. Now, if you know anything about metallurgy, you know that brass is not dug. In fact, brass is a compound alloy. And not only is it a compound alloy that you need to mix multiple metals from, but the metal that you get brass from is dug out of the ground already mixed with other metal. And so you actually have to smelt it down, remove the zinc from the alloy, and then mix it with other metals to form brass. And so brass is basically copper and zinc, and bronze is copper and tin. Now, the King James translators did know that bronze and brass were two different things in the 1600s. We learned this all throughout the 1300s. But so not only that, but brass didn't even get invented till 500 BCE. So the King James translators just blew it.